Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class, and this recording is on Unit 4, Lesson 9, Biodiversity at Different Scales. So we're still in Unit 4. Unit 4 is actually quite a long unit. I'm just going to quick look at your course outline just so you can kind of see where we are. We're in Lesson 9, but we have to go all the way in this case to Lesson 18. So we are only about halfway through this unit. Like I said, it's fairly long compared to other units. I think the lessons themselves are a little bit shorter though. So our key terms here are biodiversity, community, ecosystems, population, and species. There are other key terms here as well that will be highlighted as we go through. Don't forget, guys, to click on that link right below my picture on our website, and you will have access to the study guide that goes along with this lesson. All right, so this lesson is discussing how there are different impacts to biodiversity depending upon which impact of that ecological hierarchy is affected. So remember that we talked about the ecological hierarchy before, that we have kind of broadly, I guess you can think of the biosphere and biomes, but we're kind of talking more about an ecosystem. So the whole ecosystem is made up of all of the communities of living things and the abiotic factors as well, right? Within that community, you may have different populations of different animals and plants and fungi and bacteria and what have you. Just a bunch of different populations, and a population contains members of all of the same species, and all of them are interacting together in that community, right? So if some impact to that ecosystem occurs at a very small level, like the level of a single species or single individual or a couple different individuals, the impact on biodiversity might not be very big at all. But if the impact affects like a whole species, say, for example, or potentially multiple species within the community, then we might see a larger impact on the biodiversity of the whole ecosystem. So remember that biodiversity is like the different types of living things that are found in all the same area, that some ecosystems are more biodiverse than others. It kind of just depends on the ecosystem, but the idea is to maintain as much biodiversity as possible. And really the benefit of added biodiversity is that the more niches that are filled within an ecosystem, the more resilient that ecosystem actually is, right? So when problems arise, which they inevitably do, weather disasters, climate changes, diseases, or even human impacts, if you completely wipe out a species, if there's not very many species in an ecosystem, there really isn't any other organism that's going to take its place, and you could just wipe out a whole trophic level right on that food pyramid. So if you've got a very diverse food web and each living thing has multiple sources of food, it's not as big of an impact on the entire ecosystem as it is if biodiversity is low. So we definitely want to make sure that we maintain high levels of biodiversity. It also goes on to talk about how these factors can affect biodiversity at any level. So changes in available food resources, changes to breeding habitat, an introduction of an invasive species, the removal of a predator species, destruction of habitat by humans, natural disasters, pollution, and climate change, that those impacts can be felt at all levels of those ecological hierarchy levels. For example, here's a picture of a forest that was destroyed by a hurricane. This process is going to have a pretty big effect because it's affecting a lot of different trees. This disturbance, it says, puts stress on the entire ecosystem as multiple populations are then, they basically lose where they need to live, so they have to find a new place to live or they will die. And a smaller scale talks about if we go through a forest and you find some old trees and they get cut down because they're diseased, that this impact is fairly small on this ecosystem. that generally the organisms that lived in those trees will have to migrate to a different place, but it's not affecting the whole population of organisms, and it's not affecting multiple populations of organisms. So while there might be some effect to this, it's not going to be a permanent effect. And let's see, it calls this a micro effect. So these are smaller scale changes that might be termed micro effects, it says, because there are some insects, birds, squirrels, and chipmunks and epiphytes, which are plants that live on other plants, that might be living on these trees. They have to find a new place to live, but this effect is fairly short term and it's self-correcting. It gets fixed very quickly. Some other micro effects that are mentioned are maybe a change in water chemistry after a heavy rain, sudden temperature drop, some sort of really small kind of temporary change. That's really the key for those micro effects. Then we have a slide here on invasive species. And I know that I have been talking to you guys about invasive species for the last couple of lessons, so you've had some information about this. And in fact, they talk about emerald ash borer in this lesson, which is the invasive species that I was talking about earlier. So an invasive species is a non-native species. It's a species that's not from that ecosystem. It's not native to that ecosystem, and it has been introduced to the ecosystem. More often than not, the introduction is accidental, but sometimes it's on purpose and it's not a good thing, right? So where do these invasive species come from? They can come from, in the case of emerald ash borer, they may have just come from transportation of wood products from an area where emerald ash borer was native, and then the larva burrows through the wood and it could infest other areas, right? So this is actually from Asia, the emerald ash borer, so it's not native to the United States at all. Sometimes non-native species like plant species are planted on purpose. People put them as ornamentals in their yards, and then the seeds are transported by the wind or oftentimes by animals that eat them and transport them somewhere, and then those invasive species can spread. Another invasive plant species that we see a lot is Japanese barberry, and it's not native obviously to the United States, and it can spread very quickly, and it can really outcompete native species. So the idea is that these species, they're not from the area, but they're also invasive in that they outcompete or destroy native species. And the reason why they can do this is because they lack, oftentimes, like, there's a couple of different reasons. A lot of times they lack a natural predator. And so the area they're from, they have predators and their populations are kept in check, right? So their carrying capacity is lower. If they don't have a natural predator, their carrying capacity goes way up. Maybe they're just better competitors. We see that these species are often generalists, so they can be very adaptable, and they can adapt to a wide variety of different changes in climate and in food sources and stuff like that. So they're just better survivors in a lot of cases than our native species are. And when they wreak havoc on a natural ecosystem, they're not just non-natives, they're considered to be invasives. So the emerald ash borer is a beetle, looks like this, and it's actually the larva of the beetle that is destructive. And it bores through the wood of ash trees. And it is very, very devastating. It was first detected in the Michigan area, it says in 2002. I'm not sure when it was detected in Wisconsin. It was later than 2002 because it has been moving steadily east across the United States. It was first tracked in the east coast of the US. That's kind of where the ports and things are, right? But we have it, and it is pretty invasive here in Wisconsin. It says the hypothesis is they first came to the Midwest in the 1990s, having hitched a ride in wooden packing materials. Okay. So what do they do to the trees? They do a lot of different things. So the damage is first seen in the form of thinning crowns of the trees. So we see the tops of the trees, the foliage starts to thin. And then in the summer, when females are ready to lay eggs, they deposit them in or near crevices in the bark of large limbs, and on the upper parts of the ash tree's trunk. After hatching, the larval tunnels through bark and feed on the phloem layers that carry nutrients and sugars throughout the tree. The larvae will spend almost a year tunneling and feeding and robbing the tree of nutrients as they go. As the infestation gets bad enough, multiple larvae will encircle the tree with their tunnels and cut off the sap flow in a process known as girdling, and the tops of the trees get very weak. The next generation of female beetles lay their eggs farther down the tree. It takes about 5 years to kill a tree this way. So we see the foliage getting thin. We see the bark coming off the tree on the side. You see these D-shaped boreholes that are found in the bark as well. So the damage is pretty evident when a tree has been infested with emerald ash borer. And the only solution upon infestation is to cut the tree down. The best solution is cut the tree down and try to limit the spread of it to other ash trees in the area. But honestly, it's fighting a losing battle at this point because it's pretty much going to wipe out every ash tree in the state of Wisconsin in the next 10 years or so, unfortunately. It does go on to talk about how the USDA has explored possible biological control agents, at least one native parasitic wasp, and actually they use non-native parasitic wasps, the Asian wasp, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce here. And they release these wasps into areas where there's a lot of emerald ash borer, and the wasps are parasitic to the emerald ash borer themselves, and they can reduce the carrying capacity of emerald ash borer. And so we can see this in this graph here, that, you know, our blue line represents essentially wasps that have been parasitized. And you can see that over time, now the carrying capacity is much lower for those wasps than it is for the ones that have no parasitism. But then I looked this thing up because honestly, guys, I had never heard of this before, and we've been doing a lot of woodwalking and stuff for forestry class that my son is in, and emerald ash borer damage is pretty extreme. So I was very curious about this. So I went to check on the USDA website. And so this is an informational literature that is on the USDA website, and it talks about biological control for emerald ash borer, and it does mention this particular parasitic wasps. And it does say essentially that it does reduce the infestation, so it helps to preserve the forested area for a little longer. So it slows down the damage. And it says, will biological control ever eradicate EAB? And the answer is no. The wasps alone will not eradicate EAB. They can be helped and used in an integrated pest management plan to help control the pests and benefit our landscape. Slows it down. Hopefully at some point, they can replant other trees so that we're not losing an entire forested area, because literally there are areas of forest that are completely wiped out. So this is extremely devastating to biodiversity. So if you can introduce other acceptable trees that could also take the place of these ash trees, then you could kind of restore these forests or slow down the spread of EAB before the forest is completely decimated. Although honestly, from what I have seen in Wisconsin, that is a tall order. And I know we've talked a little bit about other species of ash tree, like I want to say it's like a Russian ash or European ash. I have to look it up, but that is naturally more resistant to EAB because it evolved along with EAB, which is from Asia, that they could potentially replant some of these forested areas with this non-native ash tree. So it's a big problem. It's a really, really big problem, and it's very, very devastating to these areas of ash forest, these ash forested areas, which are often big stands within a forest, of a lot of ash trees. So That is invasive species and how they can have a huge effect on biodiversity. And we're talking about effects at the community level there, right? Because when you wipe out an entire forest of ash trees, you are affecting species all across. You're basically completely getting rid of the entire habitat. That is pretty much it. There's a lot of check-in questions in practice here in this lesson. There's also a whole section on how they do research and kind of do some controlled laboratory studies to research things because it's harder to have controlled experimentation outside in an ecosystem. Sometimes you have to bring it indoors and you have to do some controlled laboratory studies. I'm not going to kind of go through that with you today. So that is the end of this lesson, ladies and gentlemen. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will see you guys in the next.